The heavy scent of frying catfish and seasoned cornmeal had always been the smell of home. But today, it felt like a shroud. Clara's hand trembled as she pulled a glossy, silver-embossed booklet from a pile of old invoices hidden in the back of the pantry. Its pristine surface a cold intrusion against the grease-stained walls. Her eyes locked on a single word, scrawled in her best friend's handwriting, across a map of the diner. Demolition. The date was circled with a ferocity that tore the paper. A deadline only weeks away that turned every shared memory into a lie. A sharp crash echoed from the dining room as a heavy ceramic mug shattered against the floor. Clara stepped out to find Evelyn standing by the counter, her face ashen and her knuckles white as she clutched a folder full of structural failure reports. Outside the window, a crowd was already gathering, their faces pressed against the glass as phones buzzed with a leaked headline that was spreading through the town like a wildfire. The bell above the door gave one final, violent ring before snapping off its mount, hitting the floor with a hollow metallic thud that signaled the end of the silence. The humid morning air of Natchez, Mississippi, hung heavy over the river, thick with the scent of stagnant water and the promise of a sweltering day. Inside Whitfield's diner, Clara Whitfield gripped the handle of her boning knife, the steel cool against her calloused palm. She drove the blade into the silver-gray flesh of a large catfish, the metal sliding along the spine with the practiced precision of 20 years. With a sharp, decisive tug, she separated the fillet, the pinkish meat yielding to her strength. The kitchen hummed with the familiar rhythm of the early shift, the rhythmic thumping of the exhaust fan and the aggressive hiss of the flat-top grill. Clara tossed the fish into a shallow bin of seasoned cornmeal, and a fine, golden cloud of dust billowed upward, settling like a veil over her faded apron. The bell above the heavy oak door gave a sharp, metallic ring, cutting through the sizzle of frying fat. Old Sheriff Miller shuffled in, bringing a gust of swampy heat with him. Clara wiped her hands on her thighs, the rough denim of her jeans smeared with flour, and reached for a heavy ceramic mug. She filled it with coffee so dark it looked like motor oil, steam curling around her face as she set it on the counter. Natchez was waking up, and the diner was its heartbeat. Clara felt the familiar grain of the wooden counter under her fingertips, a grounding sensation that tethered her to this floor, this town, and the legacy her father, James, had left in every grease-stained corner. She offered a tired, genuine smile to the regulars, her ears tuned to the melody of clinking silverware and the low murmur of morning gossip. Across the room, Evelyn Hayes dropped a heavy silver spoon. The clatter echoed off the linoleum, a sharp, discordant note that made the hair on Clara's neck stand up. Clara tried to catch her friend's eye, seeking the silent shorthand they had shared since they were girls baking pies in this very kitchen. But Evelyn jerked her head toward the window. She stared out at the empty parking lot, her reflection in the glass looking ghostly and thin. Evelyn's fingers, usually so steady with a ledger, nervously picked at a fraying edge of the red checkered tablecloth. Her knuckles white. Near the cash register, a pile of envelopes sat under a heavy glass ashtray, their edges stamped with the aggressive red ink of overdue notices. Evelyn pressed a palm to her temple, her eyes squeezed shut against the hum of the fluorescent overheads. When Clara stepped closer, asking softly if she needed an aspirin or a break, Evelyn merely hitched her shoulder in a sharp, defensive motion. Without a word, she turned and retreated toward the back storeroom, leaving a lingering scent of mint antacids and a thick, suffocating layer of anxiety in her wake. Clara waited until the breakfast rush thinned before heading into the dim, cramped confines of the pantry. The air here was stagnant, smelling of corrugated cardboard and the faint, rancid ghost of old cooking oil. She reached for a bulk tin of cayenne pepper on the highest shelf, her fingers brushing the cold metal, but her elbow caught a stack of leaning boxes. The top crate slid, hitting the concrete floor with a heavy thud and erupting in a fan of yellowed receipts and curling menus from the 90s. Clara dropped to her knees, her joints protesting the hard floor. She began gathering the papers, her mind drifting to the days when James Whitfield would sit in this very spot, grumbling about the price of eggs. Among the sea of gray invoices, a corner of something different caught her eye. It was paper, but too thick, too smooth and unnervingly glossy. She pulled it from the pile, the laminate feeling icy against her skin. It was pristine, a stark neon intrusion against the weathered relics of her family's past. The booklet featured a raised, silver-embossed logo that read, "Global Plate." Clara opened it, her breath hitching as she stared at a 3D architectural rendering of a massive complex. All sleek glass, brushed steel, and sterile greenery. It was a vision of a future that had no room for chipped paint or soul. Then she saw the ink. Evelyn's handwriting, usually so elegant, had carved aggressive red marks across the centerfold. A thick circle encompassed the exact plot of land where the diner stood. The word demolition was underlined 3 times in jagged strokes, and a date, less than a month away, was circled with a ferocity that made the paper pucker. Tucked into the bottom flap was a business card for a corporate acquisitions VP, with a handwritten note from Evelyn clipped to it. Discuss final buyout valuation. Clara's heart skipped a beat, then hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. A dry, bitter lump formed in her throat, tasting of betrayal and cold, hard cash. She didn't think. She moved. Clara stormed back into the main dining area, the glossy booklet trembling in her hand. She found Evelyn by the large coffee urn and shoved the paper into her face. Evelyn froze, the dark liquid she was pouring splashing over the rim of a porcelain cup and pooling on the counter. Her face went ashen, the color draining until she looked like a charcoal sketch in the harsh light. Evelyn slowly set the carafe down and wiped her hands on her apron, her movements mechanical. She refused to look up, her gaze fixed on the spilled coffee. When she finally spoke, her voice was a thin, brittle rasp. She began reciting figures and dates, detailing months of clandestine meetings in hotels outside the city limits, far from the prying eyes of Natchez neighbors. Her fists were clenched so tight, the skin over her knuckles looked ready to tear. Every word she uttered about liquidation and exit strategies felt like a heavy stone being dropped into a deep, dark well, the ripples chilling Clara to the bone. Evelyn didn't stop at the confession. She reached under the counter and hauled up a thick accordion folder, slamming it onto the wood. She began spreading out technical reports like a general laying out a map of a lost war. She pointed to photographs of the foundation, where jagged cracks snaked through the concrete like frozen lightning. Her finger jabbed at columns of numbers highlighted in neon yellow. Tax liens and high-interest loans that swallowed the diner's monthly revenue 5 times over. She shoved an engineer's report toward Clara, the text stating in clinical, unyielding terms that the southern wall was a structural liability, prone to imminent collapse. Evelyn's voice shook, a mix of desperation and cold pragmatism, as she explained that all the fried catfish in the South wouldn't generate enough profit to replace the frayed, fire-hazard wiring behind the walls. Clara looked up at the ceiling, where the paint was curling away in long, jaundiced strips, while Evelyn laid out the undeniable evidence of their ruin. "This isn't about the money, Evelyn." Clara's hand slammed onto the table, the force rattling the silverware in their tins. Her voice cracked like a whip in the empty room, accusing Evelyn of spitting on the memory of the man who had treated her like a second daughter. Evelyn recoiled, her hands flying up to cover her face as a muffled, ragged sob escaped her throat. Clara shouted about roots, about the soul of a town that was being sold for a parking lot. But Evelyn only shook her head, her mascara smearing into dark, ugly tracks down her cheeks. She grabbed her leather handbag, her movements frantic, and bolted for the door. The heavy oak swung shut with a violent crash, the bell finally snapping off its mount and hitting the floor with a lonely, final chime. Clara stood alone in the sudden silence, her chest heaving, surrounded by the paper trail of a friendship that had just been incinerated. In the shadows of a corner booth, Sam, a reporter for the Natchez Ledger, didn't look up from his plate of cold eggs, but his thumbs moved with lightning speed across his smartphone screen. He had caught every syllable of the Whitfield explosion, his glasses reflecting the blue light of the display. With a single sharp tap, he hit publish. Within 60 seconds, the phone in Clara's pocket began to buzz incessantly. She ignored it at first, but the vibration was a persistent, nagging reminder of the world outside. On the local newsfeed, a headline flashed: "End of an era. Whitfield's to be replaced by Global Plate Megacenter." Sam drained the last of his lukewarm coffee, tossed a few crumpled bills on the table, and slipped out the door before Clara could process the digital wildfire he had just ignited. She stared at the screen, watching the comment count climb into the hundreds, a digital tombstone for her life's work. By the time the sun began to dip toward the horizon, the heavy doors of the diner groaned under the pressure of a crowd. The parking lot was a sea of idling engines and flickering headlights. Clara stepped out from the kitchen, her silhouette framed against the warm glow of the interior, and saw dozens of familiar faces pressed against the glass. Old Man Barnes, a farmer whose family had eaten here for 3 generations, stood at the front, waving a printout of the news article like a weapon. Behind him, women from the First Baptist Choir whispered behind their hands, their eyes darting between Clara and the for sale signs that seemed to materialize in their imaginations. The air in the dining room grew thick and oppressive, smelling of damp wool and the electric charge of a mob. Clara felt the weight of their expectations, their judgment, and their fear, all of them demanding she tell them their memories weren't about to be flattened by a corporate bulldozer. Outside, the street became a microcosm of a divided nation. A group of younger residents, dressed in sleek jackets and holding expensive lattes, gathered near the edge of the lot, talking loudly about the economic revitalization and the multi-screen cinema Global Plate had promised. They were met with a wall of older men in stained Carhartt jackets and faded caps, who stood like sentries before Clara's door. Insults were hurled over the heads of the crowd. Words like progress and opportunity clashed with tradition and greed. Clara watched through the window as neighbors who had shared pews on Sunday now glared at one another with genuine loathing. The sound was a discordant roar, a cacophony where the value of a dollar and the value of a memory fought for dominance. The town of Natchez was no longer a community. It was a fractured thing, and the crack ran directly through the heart of Whitfield's diner. Once the crowd dispersed under the threat of a midnight rain, Clara turned the heavy brass key in the lock, the click sounding like a gunshot in the hollow room. The only sound was the steady, rhythmic ticking of the ancient clock on the wall. She sank to her knees by the baseboard, her fingers tracing the deep, jagged fissure in the concrete floor. The chill of the Mississippi mud seemed to seep up through the foundation, a physical confirmation of Evelyn's grim reports. She clicked on a single desk lamp, the pool of yellow light illuminating a stack of legal handbooks and property records she had hauled from the attic. The shadows of the empty chairs stretched across the floor like long, skeletal fingers reaching for her throat. As she pored over the fine print of state zoning laws and corporate liability, the cold reality set in. She wasn't just fighting Evelyn or a company. She was fighting the inexorable machinery of the law and the bottomless pockets of a global empire. A few blocks away, Evelyn sat in the cramped cabin of her car, the engine off, staring at the darkened silhouette of the diner. Her breath fogged the windshield. With trembling fingers, she pulled the Global Plate business card from her pocket and dialed the number. When a man with a voice like dry parchment answered on the second ring, Evelyn took a shuddering breath. She officially stated her consent to the buyout, her voice hardening with a finality that surprised her. Tears blurred her vision, making the streetlights dance, but she didn't let her voice waver. She ended the call and let the phone slip onto the passenger's seat. In the rearview mirror, she could see the lone, flickering light in the diner's window where Clara was still awake. But Evelyn turned the key. The engine roared to life, and she pressed the gas, driving away from the only home she had ever known. The following morning, the sound of tires on gravel announced a new arrival. A tall man in a charcoal suit that cost more than Clara's truck stepped out of a black sedan, following Evelyn to the front door. Evelyn kept her eyes shielded behind dark, oversized sunglasses, her posture stiff as a board. The man extracted a thick, cream-colored envelope from a leather briefcase, the gold foil of his firm's logo catching the harsh Mississippi sun. Clara froze behind the counter, a tray of clean glasses mid-air. The lawyer stepped forward, the dry rustle of the legal notice sounding louder than the morning traffic. He extended the papers toward Clara, his expression one of practiced, professional indifference. Evelyn stood 5 feet behind him, her arms tightly crossed over her chest, her lips compressed into a thin, colorless line that spoke of a bridge already burned. Before Clara could find her voice, the lawyer made a sharp gesture toward a white van idling at the curb. A city inspector emerged, clutching a digital tablet and a laser rangefinder. Evelyn pointed a gloved finger toward the base of the building where moss had begun to claim the wood. The inspector knelt, a red laser dot dancing across the foundation before disappearing into the maw of a particularly deep crack. The device emitted a sharp, electronic chirp, signaling a critical structural deviation. The inspector shook his head, his face grim as he tapped data into his tablet. Evelyn tapped her heel against the pavement, a rhythmic, nervous sound that grated on Clara's nerves. The air around the porch began to smell of damp earth and the cold, metallic scent of an official record being sealed. Clara moved to the doorway, her boots planted wide on the threshold, her hands gripping the frame until the wood groaned. As the inspector tried to brush past her to enter the kitchen, she blocked his path, her stained apron brushing against his crisp uniform. She demanded to see a warrant, her voice dropping into a low, dangerous register that vibrated with suppressed fury. Evelyn took a tentative step forward, her mouth opening as if to explain. But Clara turned a look on her so icy and sharp that Evelyn recoiled, bumping into a porch pillar. The inspector adjusted his glasses, glancing at the lawyer for guidance, hesitant to use physical force against a woman who looked ready to burn the world down. In the narrow doorway, the scent of frying onions clashed with the ozone of a looming storm. Clara standing her ground and shouting about property rights and the arrival of her own counsel. A sudden roar of voices erupted from the street. A dozen students in bright hoodies swarmed the front of the diner, carrying rolls of heavy-duty adhesive tape and glossy posters. Clara watched in horror as they slapped a massive "Future Home of Global Plate" banner across the front window, obscuring the hand-painted Whitfield's Home Cooking sign that had been there for 50 years. The students cheered, snapping selfies against the backdrop of the barricaded diner. Clara saw their palms leaving greasy smudges on the glass she had polished just hours ago. The chants of "Jobs Now" and "Progress for Natchez" seeped through the cracks in the door, turning the once warm dining room into a besieged bunker. The world outside was loud, young, and utterly indifferent to the history contained within these walls. Clara didn't wait for them to finish. She hauled an aluminum stepladder from the closet and slammed it onto the sidewalk with a metallic clang. Shoving past a surprised student, she climbed 3 rungs and dug her fingernails into the corner of the fresh poster. The plastic-coated paper tore with a shrill, agonizing screech, exposing jagged strips of the glass beneath. She ripped at the progress banner with a primal energy, the scraps of glossy paper fluttering to the wet pavement like dead leaves. From the safety of her SUV, Evelyn watched the display, her windows rolled up against the light drizzle. Her fingers were white where they gripped a folder of unpaid debt notices. Clara's breath came in ragged gasps, her hair falling out of its bun and a thin red scratch appearing on her cheek where the paper had sliced the skin. But she didn't stop until her window was clear again. Inside, the inspector was no longer asking permission. He moved through the dining area and stepped into the dim, cool air of the pantry, his high-powered flashlight cutting through the gloom. The beam landed on a sprawling, velvet-textured patch of black mold creeping up from the baseboard. Clara tried to step in front of it, to hide the decay with her own body. But the inspector was already reaching for a roll of heavy, red plastic tape. The sound of the tape being pulled, a sharp, violent zip, echoed off the tiles as he slapped a giant X across the kitchen entrance. The word "unsafe" was printed in bold, black block letters. Clara felt the moisture vanish from her throat, the air suddenly tasting of bleach and ancient rot. The inspector snapped a heavy, numbered seal onto the gas line and the pantry door, effectively stripping Clara of her ability to cook a single egg in her own kitchen. As the town fell into a restless sleep, Clara remained in the darkened diner, the only light coming from a single bulb over the bar. She had a bucket of gray hydraulic cement, the chemical odor sharp enough to make her eyes water. She knelt on the floor, using a steel spatula to force the thick paste into the cracks of the foundation, her movements frantic and desperate. Her hands shook with exhaustion, the grit of the cement settling into the deep lines of her palms. She moved from the floor to the walls, frantically smoothing over the imperfections she had ignored for years, whispering curses against the corporation and Evelyn under her breath. The shadows of the empty bar stools danced on the ceiling like mocking spectators as she tried to patch a sinking ship with her bare hands, praying she could hide enough of the truth to pass a second inspection. The morning brought a courier in a crisp blue uniform. He handed Clara a thick envelope bearing the seal of the county court. She tore it open to find a restraining order and a petition for emergency conservatorship. Evelyn was formally arguing that Clara was mentally unfit to manage the business, citing unpredictable outbursts of rage and endangerment of public safety. Clara read the description of her assault on the corporate banner, the words twisted into a narrative of a woman losing her mind. Attached were grainy photos of her on the ladder, her face contorted in anger. The paper smelled of fresh ink and betrayal. Her heart thudded against her ribs, a sickening realization dawning. Her own sister was using her grief and her fight as weapons to institutionalize her. Fueled by a cold, crystalline rage, Clara threw open the front doors and stepped onto the porch. A dozen camera flashes erupted instantly, blinding her for a second. Microphones with local news logos were shoved toward her face like the heads of hungry snakes. Clara grabbed the nearest one, her knuckles white. She didn't look at the reporters. She looked directly into the lens of the main camera. Her voice didn't shake. It rang out with a metallic edge as she called Global Plate vultures, and Evelyn a traitor to her own blood. She spoke of a town losing its soul for a strip mall, her words catching the wind and carrying down the street. A single tear escaped and tracked through the dust on her cheek. A flash of vulnerability that the cameras captured with predatory precision. Behind her, the quiet streets of Natchez seemed to hold their breath. The afternoon mail brought a final, gold-embossed envelope from Global Plate. Inside was a formal notice for the final contract signing. Thursday, 10 a.m., at their regional headquarters. It wasn't an invitation. It was a notification of an ending. Clara crumpled the expensive vellum in her fist, the sharp edges drawing a bead of blood from her palm. The letter ignored her protests, her lawsuits, and her presence entirely, treating the sale as a foregone conclusion because Evelyn had already signed the preliminary intent. Clara stared at the corporate logo, which now looked like a brand scorched into the side of her life. Her world had been narrowed down to a single square on a calendar, a countdown to the moment her family's name would be legally deleted. That night, Clara sat by the telephone, the plastic handset feeling heavy as lead. She dialed Evelyn's number. In a dark driveway across town, Evelyn saw Clara flash on her screen, the light illuminating the tears she had been crying in the dark. She didn't pick up. She watched the phone vibrate against the dashboard until it went still, only for it to start again 5 seconds later. Clara whispered into the voicemail, her voice breaking as she begged for one last conversation, one moment of sanity. Evelyn watched her own hands, the ones that had helped Clara knead dough for 20 years, and saw they were shaking. She reached out and swiped the decline button with a jerky, violent motion. In the diner, Clara heard the click of the disconnection, a sound as final as a coffin lid being nailed shut. At 3 a.m, a deputy arrived to staple a final notice to the diner's door. The paper was damp with the thick Mississippi fog, clinging to the wood like a shroud. Clara read the bold text: "Order for mandatory vacation and demolition." The building had been condemned as an immediate public hazard. She sank onto the top step, the cold of the concrete seeped through her jeans and into her bones. In the distance, the mournful whistle of a freight train echoed across the river. She had 72 hours. 72 hours before a wrecking ball would turn her father's legacy into a pile of splinters and dust. She closed her eyes and saw Evelyn's hand holding that gold pen, poised to sign the warrant for the diner's execution. The first light of Thursday morning didn't bring hope. It brought the sound of grinding metal. Clara pulled back the curtain to see a crew of men in dark uniforms unloading heavy steel barricades. They moved with military efficiency, encircling the diner in a ring of iron that cut the building off from the sidewalk and the street. Security guards with Global Plate patches stood at 10-foot intervals, their black tactical vests and buzzing radios a stark contrast to the quiet historic district. High-intensity floodlights remained on, washing out the dawn and making the diner look like a crime scene. Clara pressed her forehead against the glass, the vibration of the idling security trucks rattling her teeth. Her home was no longer a place of business. It was a cage. A long black limousine purred to a halt at the edge of the barricade. The door opened with a soft, expensive click, and Evelyn stepped out. She looked fragile in a tailored black coat, her eyes hidden behind dark lenses. A phalanx of men in gray suits immediately surrounded her, forming a human wall that moved toward the diner. The crowd of activists at the perimeter erupted into a cacophony of boos and whistles. A sign reading, "History isn't for sale," was shoved toward Evelyn, but she didn't flinch. She kept her head down, her heels clicking a rapid, hollow rhythm on the pavement as she ignored the vitriol of the people she had grown up with. The lawyers behind her were already unzipping leather portfolios, the white pages of the contract fluttering in the wind. The Natchez police arrived in force, Sheriff Miller leading a line of deputies who stood shoulder to shoulder to keep the two factions apart. The air grew thick with the smell of exhaust and the bitter tang of wood smoke from a nearby protest fire. A group of pro-development college students began a rhythmic chant. New jobs, new future. Their voices high and aggressive. Suddenly, a handful of glossy corporate flyers was flung into the air, caught by a gust of wind. They pelted the diner's windows like plastic hail. Clara watched from inside as the progress propaganda obscured her view of the street. One deputy lost his footing as the crowd surged forward, his hand going to his belt as the roar of the mob reached a fever pitch, drowning out the morning birds. Clara turned the heavy iron bolt on the front door, the sound a solid, satisfying thud. She didn't stop there. She grabbed the edge of a heavy oak table, one where the mayor had sat for lunch every Tuesday for a decade, and heaved it toward the door. The legs shrieked across the floor, carving white gouges into the linoleum. She piled chairs on top, then dragged a stack of empty beer kegs from the bar to reinforce the base. The room grew dim as she blocked the light from the windows, the diner transforming into a shadowed vault. She wiped a mix of sweat and grease from her brow with her sleeve, her breath coming in short, sharp bursts. Outside, the world was screaming, but inside, she had created a silent, desperate fortress. A sudden, sharp rapping on the glass made Clara jump. Evelyn was there, her face pressed against a narrow gap in the barricade she had helped build. Her breath left a small, pathetic fog on the pane. Without her sunglasses, her eyes looked hollow, rimmed with red, and filled with a frantic kind of terror. She shouted through the glass, her voice muffled but high-pitched, pleading with Clara to open the door before the crowd broke through the police line. She pointed toward the street, where the steel barriers were already swaying under the weight of the protesters. Her fingers clawed at the window frame, a silent plea for sanctuary from the very chaos she had unleashed. Clara stood back in the shadows, watching her sister friend crumble, but she didn't move toward the lock. The sound of the first brick hitting the window was like a gunshot. The thick, tempered glass, which had survived hurricanes and decades of heat, shattered into 1,000 glittering diamonds. A jagged hole appeared, and the humid outside air rushed in, carrying the scent of asphalt and anger. A shower of glass fell over Clara's shoulders, the shards crunching under her boots as she dove behind the counter. One large fragment sliced through the air and embedded itself in the mahogany back bar with a dull thud. Clara stayed low, her heart hammering against the floorboards. The triumphant roar from the street was deafening, a primal sound that signaled the end of civility. The home cooking sign was now a jagged ruin, and the sanctuary was breached. Through the hole in the window, a voice amplified by a megaphone cut through the chaos. It was the lead representative for Global Plate, his tone a chilling blend of authority and boredom. He announced a 10-minute countdown. 10 minutes for Clara to vacate the premises before emergency structural stabilization, a corporate euphemism for demolition, would begin. Clara watched a man in an orange vest point a heavy sledgehammer toward the door. The crowd behind him surged, people picking up pieces of the broken sidewalk to use as missiles. Every word about liability and urban renewal felt like a nail being driven into her coffin. Clara gripped a dampened dish towel, her eyes fixed on the slow, mechanical sweep of the clock's second hand. Outside, on the hood of the black limousine, the lawyers were preparing the altar. They laid out the pages of the final deed, the white paper blindingly bright against the black paint. They used heavy gold clips to keep the documents from blowing away in the rising wind. Evelyn stood over the car, her shadow stretching across the legal jargon. A lawyer with a predatory smile offered her a heavy, gold-plated fountain pen. It caught the sun, glinting like a needle. Clara watched through the shattered glass as Evelyn's fingers hovered over the signature line. The lawyers were whispering in her ear, urging her to finish it, to take the money and run. Evelyn's hand was a trembling, uncertain thing, but it was descending toward the paper. Clara felt a sudden, terrifying lightness in her limbs. She looked around the kitchen, at the cold fryers, the empty prep tables, and the darkened grill. The fight felt like it had been drained out of her, replaced by a cold, numbing realization that no amount of furniture or anger could stop a pen. The silence inside the diner, broken only by the distant shouting, felt heavy and final. She watched a stray beam of light illuminate the dust motes dancing over the counter. The legacy of 3 generations was about to be erased by a signature, and there was nothing left in the law books to stop it. She felt like a ghost haunting her own life, a spectator to her own extinction. A sudden draft swirled through the broken window, kicking up a cloud of flour from the floor. It carried the scent of the building itself, the deep, permanent aroma of dried sage, smoked paprika, and decades of slow-cooked pork. It was the smell of her father's hands. Clara inhaled deeply, and a memory struck her with the force of a physical blow. She remembered the hidden compartment in the back of the cellar, behind the rusted shelving. James had kept a leather-bound ledger there, not for money, but for the blood of the house, the original, handwritten recipes that had built Natchez. The scent wasn't just food, it was a map. Her eyes cleared, the hollow despair replaced by a sharp, focused desperation. She knew what she had to do. She scrambled toward the back of the kitchen, her boots sliding on the spilled flour. She kicked aside a wicker bread basket and tore up the heavy rug near the walk-in cooler. Her fingers found the recessed iron ring of the cellar door. Outside, the sound of wood splintering told her the barricade was failing. She didn't look back. She dropped into the darkness of the sub-basement, nearly tumbling down the steep wooden stairs. The air down here was cool and smelled of damp limestone. Above her, the heavy thud of boots on the porch floorboards rumbled like thunder. She scrambled through the dark, her hands raking over old crates and cobwebs, until her fingers brushed the cold, oil-slicked leather of the ledger. She hugged it to her chest as if it were a child. The ceiling above her groaned. A loud crack echoed through the floorboards as a security guard's boot punched through a weakened plank. Clara didn't wait to see the light from their flashlights. She scrambled back up the ladder, the ledger tucked firmly under her arm. She burst back into the kitchen just as the front door began to yield. She didn't look at the intruders. She moved to the stove and cranked the gas dials to the maximum. She grabbed a heavy cast-iron skillet and threw a pound of butter onto it, the fat screaming as it hit the heat. She followed it with a mountain of dark brown sugar, the smell of caramelizing sugar instantly fighting back the scent of the mob. She tore open the ledger, her eyes scanning her father's frantic, looping script. She began throwing spices into the pan: cloves, star anise, and a heavy dose of the Whitfield secret cinnamon blend. The kitchen filled with a thick, aromatic steam that was almost intoxicating. The heavy, sweet, spicy cloud billowed out of the broken windows, a physical wave of scent that rolled over the parking lot. It was an aggressive, undeniable smell, the scent of every holiday, every comfort, and every home the people of Natchez had ever known. The man with the sledgehammer paused, his arms dropping as the aroma hit him. The shouting died down, replaced by a confused, hungry silence. Evelyn, still standing over the limousine, felt the scent wrap around her like a shroud. Her eyes widened, her nostrils flaring as the smell of her own grandmother's kitchen invaded the sterile corporate space. The gold pen in her hand wavered, leaving a jagged, ugly ink blot on the agreement of sale. The parking lot no longer smelled of conflict. It smelled of peace. Evelyn's breath hitched. The smell was a key turning in a lock she had forgotten existed. She saw herself at 6 years old, sitting on a flour sack while James Whitfield let her lick the spoon. She remembered the promise they had made to never let the fire go out. Her hand began to shake uncontrollably, the expensive pen rattling against the car's hood. She looked at the contract, the cold, heartless Exhibit A and Exhibit B, and saw them for what they were, a death warrant for her soul. A single heavy tear hit the paper, blurring the corporate seal into a gray smudge. The progress she had fought for now felt like ashes in her mouth. Clara emerged from the ruins of the front door, her face smudged with soot and flour. She carried a large, steaming pie on a chipped ceramic platter, the crust a perfect bubbling gold. The steam rose in fragrant pillars, catching the morning light. She walked to the edge of the porch, the silence of the crowd so profound she could hear the distant hum of a bee. She didn't say a word. She simply held the pie out, the very essence of the Whitfield legacy manifest in flour and fruit. The protesters stared, their anger evaporating as the primal connection to food and memory took hold. She stood there, a lone woman with a pie, and the entire corporate machine seemed to grind to a halt in the face of it. Evelyn looked up at Clara, and the two women locked eyes across the shattered glass and the suits. Evelyn's face hardened into something Clara hadn't seen in years, the old Evelyn, the one who wasn't afraid of the dark. She dropped the gold pen, letting it clatter onto the asphalt. She grabbed the first page of the contract and ripped it down the center with a violent, liberating sound. She didn't stop until the entire document was a pile of white confetti on the ground. She kicked the scraps into the gutter, her chin tilted up. The lawyers began to shout, pointing at the binding nature of the previous signatures. But Evelyn ignored them. She stepped away from the limo and toward the porch, her path clearing as the crowd instinctively parted for her. The Global Plate representative, his face turning a dark, bruised purple, lunged forward. He reached for Evelyn's arm, his voice a snarl of legal consequences and breach of contract. His hand was inches from her coat when a massive, tan-sleeved arm blocked his path. Sheriff Miller stepped between them, his presence like a mountain. He didn't pull his weapon. He simply leaned in, his badge gleaming. He told the man in the suit that the air in Natchez was getting a bit too thick for outsiders, and that it was time for the vultures to fly home. The lawyer looked at the sheriff, then at the silent, watching crowd, and realized that the law of the land had just been superseded by the law of the heart. He backed away, his polished shoes scuffing the dirt. Within minutes, a new signal rippled through the security team. The emergency was over. The guards began unlinking the steel barriers, the rhythmic clink, clink, clink of the chains sounding like a victory march. The heavy trucks roared to life, but this time they were backing out, their tires spitting gravel as they retreated. The black limousine idling at the curb pulled away, its tinted windows hiding the defeated faces of the corporate board. Clara and Evelyn stood on the porch together, watching the iron ring around their life dissolve. As the last truck turned the corner, the only sound left was the wind in the oaks and the soft, tentative cheers of the neighbors. Old Man Barnes was the first to move. He walked up to the porch, his eyes wet, and reached into the pocket of his overalls. He pulled out a crumpled $5 bill, the price of a slice of pie and a cup of coffee, and dropped it into an empty coffee tin Clara had left on the windowsill. One by one, the people of Natchez followed. The clink of coins and the rustle of bills began to fill the tin. The revitalization students, looking sheepish, added their lunch money to the pile. It wasn't just a donation. It was a down payment on the future of the town. Clara watched the tin fill, a lump forming in her throat that had nothing to do with sadness. The town was buying back its heart, $1 at a time. Evelyn turned to Clara, her coat stained with dust and her hair a mess. She didn't say anything. She just let out a long, shuddering breath and collapsed into Clara's arms. They sank to the porch floor together, surrounded by the shards of the broken window. Clara held her own tears finally breaking free, washing tracks through the flour on her face. In the quiet of the morning, they sat on the ruins of their battle, two sisters who had almost lost everything to remember what they actually had. The smell of the pie was still strong, a sweet anchor in a world that had tried to drift away. Clara stroked Evelyn's hair, the silence finally becoming a comfortable thing. The sun was high in the sky when the two women emerged with buckets of hot, soapy water and stiff scrub brushes. Clara had her sleeves rolled up, her jaw set with a new kind of determination. Evelyn held a heavy steel scraper, its edge glinting. They didn't go inside to clean the kitchen. They started on the outside. Clara dunked her brush and began to scrub the soot from the wood, the gray water cascading down the boards. Evelyn attacked a patch of peeling, sun-bleached paint, the scraper making a rhythmic, satisfying shh-shh-shh sound. They worked in a silent, perfect synchronicity, the movement of their arms a testament to a restored bond. Evelyn put her weight into the scraper, and a large sheet of the old jaundiced paint curled away, revealing the deep, dark grain of the original oak beneath. Clara followed behind her with a block of sandpaper, smoothing the wood until it felt like silk. They found the marks James had made years ago to measure the height of the new siding, ghosts of the past supporting the work of the present. The wood was solid, unaffected by the cracks in the foundation. Evelyn wiped the sweat from her eyes and looked at the clean, bare wood. For the first time in months, the weight in her chest felt like it had been replaced by the honest ache of hard work. As the shadows lengthened across the street, Clara reached into her apron pocket and pulled out a small, hand-painted wooden sign. She hung it on the front door, the brass hook catching the last of the light. It read, "Open," in bold, proud letters. Inside, the sound of the coffee machine's hiss signaled that the heart of the building was beating again. A fresh pot began to brew, the scent of dark roast drifting out to greet the evening air. Clara sat on the edge of the counter, watching Evelyn pour the first 2 cups. They didn't have a plan for the debt or the repairs yet. But as the first customer, Sheriff Miller, walked through the door, Clara knew the fire was back on.